The world that produces Billy Batson does not announce itself as dangerous. It presents as ordinary, almost tender in its assumptions. Childhood is treated as a protected territory, innocence as a moral shield, and desire as something that will be corrected by time. The city around him is loud and indifferent, but the mythology that frames him insists on reassurance. Power, in this world, is imagined as a reward for goodness. Authority is imagined as something granted to those who remain uncorrupted. The rules are simple enough to feel safe. If you are pure, you will be chosen. If you are chosen, you will be protected. This is the foundation upon which the fantasy rests. It is not a story about strength emerging from hardship, but about strength arriving intact, untouched by the costs that usually accompany it. The environment around Billy does not prepare him for power as a burden. It prepares him to long for it as an escape. Adults fail him in mundane ways. Institutions misfire. The city closes its doors. Yet the moral architecture that surrounds him promises a shortcut. Somewhere beyond the noise, there exists a throne that does not demand maturity as its price of entry. The figure of Captain Marvel emerges inside this system as a projection of wholeness. He is not built through discipline, loss, or gradual reckoning. He arrives fully formed, tall, composed, resonant with certainty. His voice carries authority without strain. His body occupies space without hesitation. He does not negotiate with the world. The world yields. The transformation does not symbolize growth. It symbolizes replacement. The boy disappears. The ideal steps forward. This distinction matters. In many heroic myths, power amplifies what already exists, sharpening traits and exposing contradictions. Here, power conceals them. It creates a clean surface where fractures should be visible. The adult form does not extend the child's interior development. It eclipses it. The city reads this figure as a savior because it recognizes symbols more easily than processes. A crown is easier to trust than a mind still forming its ethics. Billy himself experiences this not as corruption, but as relief. The moment of transformation suspends consequence. Hunger, fear, smallness, and uncertainty dissolve into spectacle. He does not need to learn how to be powerful. He needs only to speak the word. The ritual is mechanical, not psychological. The body changes. The status changes. The inner structure remains untouched. This is the quiet tension that defines the world before the crisis. A system has been established in which power and maturity are no longer linked. Authority exists without accountability. The throne stands without a foundation. Everyone agrees to pretend this is sustainable because the alternative would require confronting how deeply the fantasy is needed. The city benefits from this arrangement. It gains a guardian without confronting its own failures. Institutions remain hollow, but they are no longer questioned. Danger is externalized, dramatized, and resolved through spectacle. The presence of Captain Marvel reassures the public that virtue can still descend from above. The fantasy is collective. It is not merely Billy's escape. It is the culture's. Yet beneath this surface calm, something presses outward. The child has not disappeared. He has been displaced. His confusion, resentment, longing, and unfinished identity have not been resolved. They have been sealed behind an adult mask that moves through the world as if certainty were natural. The pressure accumulates quietly. A foundation that does not bear weight does not crack immediately. It sinks. Power, in this context, behaves like gravity without counterbalance. It pulls attention, trust, and moral authority toward itself, while demanding nothing in return. The boy inside remains unseen, unheard, and unchallenged. This is not cruelty. It is neglect elevated to myth. The opening calm of this world depends on one shared assumption: that innocence, once rewarded, can remain innocent forever. That the child who never had to grow into power will somehow grow anyway. That the crown will teach the head how to wear it. But systems built on fantasy do not collapse through villains alone. They collapse through exposure. They collapse when the distance between appearance and structure becomes impossible to ignore. Before the first visible failure, before the first irreversible choice, the imbalance already exists. It exists in every moment where power is exercised without reflection, in every victory that requires no reckoning, in every cheer that replaces scrutiny. Billy Batson stands at the center of this arrangement as both beneficiary and casualty. He is not malicious. He is not calculating. He is unfinished. The tragedy is not that he holds power too early. It is that the world asks him to hold it without ever demanding that he become someone capable of carrying its weight. The stage is set not for a fall from grace, but for a prolonged distortion, a myth that continues to function even as its internal logic erodes, a hero who embodies the dream of innocence preserved, while quietly demonstrating the cost of believing such a dream can survive contact with reality. The conflict has not yet announced itself. No line has been crossed. No catastrophe has occurred. But the imbalance is already active. The territory has been claimed by a symbol that does not understand the land it governs. The crown shines. The city applauds. The child remains inside, waiting, unaddressed. And in that waiting, the fantasy begins to strain. Billy Batson enters his story already displaced, not only socially or materially, but symbolically. He does not belong to a lineage, an institution, or a stable narrative of origin. His past is fragmented, his future abstract. This absence does not produce reflection. It produces longing. He is shaped less by what he has endured than by what he has been denied. Continuity, recognition, a stable place within a structure that affirms his existence. The world around him treats this absence as unfortunate, but not formative. It frames childhood instability as something temporary, something that time will smooth over. Yet time does not function evenly across psyches. For a child without anchors, the future becomes less a horizon and more a rescue fantasy. Billy does not imagine himself growing into strength. He imagines being lifted out of weakness. The difference is subtle but decisive. Captain Marvel appears precisely at this psychological fault line. He is not an extension of Billy's capacities, but an answer to Billy's lack. He embodies everything the boy cannot yet articulate, let alone integrate. Confidence without doubt, authority without negotiation, belonging without history. The adult form does not ask Billy to reconcile with his limitations. It renders them irrelevant. This is not empowerment through development. It is empowerment through substitution. The symbolic logic of the transformation matters more than its spectacle. Billy does not train. He does not fail forward. He does not test boundaries and suffer consequences. He speaks a word, and the world reorganizes itself around him. This ritual bypasses the slow construction of selfhood. It installs an identity rather than cultivating one. The power does not challenge the boy's internal chaos. It conceals it behind coherence. This structure reflects a deeper cultural assumption about innocence. Innocence is treated as moral capital, something that grants access to authority, rather than something that must be protected from it. The narrative suggests that purity qualifies one to wield force responsibly. Yet purity, in this context, is defined negatively. It is the absence of corruption, not the presence of discernment. Billy is chosen not because he understands power, but because he has not yet been damaged by it. This creates an ethical vacuum. The adult figure carries the visual and rhetorical markers of wisdom, but none of its internal architecture. The voice is steady. The posture is assured. The gaze is calm. These signals convince the world, and often the audience, that maturity has occurred. But maturity is not a costume. It is a pattern of restraint, anticipation, and accountability that emerges only through sustained exposure to consequence. Billy's psychology remains adolescent beneath the surface. His desires are immediate. His moral reasoning situational. His sense of self dependent on external validation. The adult body amplifies these traits rather than correcting them. What might have been harmless impulsivity in a child becomes destabilizing when backed by godlike force. The fantasy insists this amplification will be benign. The structure quietly disagrees. The origins of this power further complicate the equation. The source is ancient, symbolic, and authoritative. It arrives not as a mentor, but as a judge. It bestows without guidance. It names a successor without assuming responsibility for the succession. The act resembles coronation more than initiation. The throne is inherited without instruction on governance. The crown is placed, then the architect withdraws. This absence of mediation is critical. In many myths, the transfer of power is accompanied by trials designed to fracture the ego before it can harden. Here, the ego is preserved and rewarded simultaneously. Billy is not humbled by the transformation. He is delighted by it. The pleasure is immediate and intoxicating. The world finally responds to him. Doors open. Threats retreat. Fear dissolves into applause. The contrast between Billy and Captain Marvel thus becomes a study in split identity. The child represents vulnerability without agency. The hero represents agency without vulnerability. They do not integrate. They alternate. One disappears so the other can function. This oscillation prevents synthesis. Billy does not learn how to be strong while remaining himself. He learns how to stop being himself in order to be strong. This split mirrors a broader cultural discomfort with adolescence. Society often treats the transition from child to adult as something that should be accelerated or skipped. Power is admired. Dependency is scorned. Uncertainty is tolerated only briefly. Billy's transformation flatters this impatience. It reassures the audience that unresolved youth can be overwritten by spectacle, that maturity can be worn like armor rather than grown like muscle. The antagonistic forces that emerge later in the narrative are seated here. They are not simply external threats. They are structural responses to imbalance. A system that grants power without maturity invites opposition that exposes this gap. Villains in this world often embody distorted reflections of desire, resentment, or wounded authority. They are not anomalies. They are consequences. Billy's ethical framework remains reactive. He responds to danger rather than anticipating it. He seeks approval rather than coherence. His decisions are guided by emotion and improvisation rather than principle. This does not make him cruel. It makes him unreliable. The fantasy insists that goodness will compensate for inexperience. The narrative gradually reveals the limits of this belief. The cultural moment that produced Captain Marvel is inseparable from this psychology. He emerges in an era that craves reassurance, an era suspicious of ambiguity, an era that prefers clear symbols to complex processes. The smiling hero who can do everything and doubts nothing becomes an ideal container for collective anxiety. He promises safety without introspection, resolution without cost. Yet myths endure not because they comfort, but because they reveal. The foundations of this narrative are laid in contradiction. Power is framed as liberation, but functions as avoidance. Innocence is framed as virtue, but operates as ignorance. Authority is displayed, but not inhabited. These tensions do not announce themselves immediately. They accumulate. They wait. Billy Batson is not a cautionary tale because he is unworthy. He is a cautionary tale because he is incomplete. The system that elevates him refuses to acknowledge this incompleteness. It mistakes potential for readiness. It mistakes absence of malice for presence of wisdom. It mistakes a clean surface for a stable structure. By the time the central conflict begins to take shape, the psychological terrain has already been mapped. A child has been given a throne. A symbol has replaced a process. A fantasy has been institutionalized. The forces that will soon collide are not improvisations. They are the logical extensions of a foundation built on displacement. The story does not ask whether Billy deserves power. It asks whether power can remain ethical when divorced from the slow, often painful formation of selfhood. It asks what happens when innocence is preserved not through care, but through denial. And it asks why cultures return, again and again, to myths that promise salvation without transformation. The field is now fully charged. The forces are in position. The transformation that once felt like escape begins to reveal itself as a fracture that cannot remain hidden indefinitely. The conflict begins not with catastrophe, but with repetition. Billy learns quickly that the transformation works every time. The word is spoken. The body changes. The world complies. What initially felt miraculous becomes procedural. Power loses its sacredness when it proves reliable. Each successful intervention reinforces a subtle belief that authority does not require preparation, only access. The city responds with gratitude and awe, confirming the illusion that outcomes validate decisions regardless of how those decisions were formed. This stage of the narrative is defined by expansion. Captain Marvel occupies more space, both physically and symbolically. He moves freely through institutions that once ignored Billy entirely. Police forces defer. Civilians cheer. Threats retreat at the sight of him. The hero becomes a moving center of gravity, reorganizing the social field around his presence. The city begins to rely on him, not only for protection, but for meaning. He reassures by existing. Billy experiences this expansion as affirmation rather than responsibility. Each victory feels like proof that the fantasy is sustainable. His choices rarely face resistance strong enough to demand reconsideration. When consequences do appear, they are deflected by charm, strength, or coincidence. The narrative structure protects him, reinforcing the idea that moral intention is sufficient. Reflection remains optional, yet beneath this surface success, the internal split deepens. Billy does not become more integrated. He becomes more dependent on the transformation. The boy's world feels increasingly small, constrained, and irrelevant. Problems that once demanded adaptation now feel intolerable. Why negotiate when one can transform? Why endure when escape is immediate? Power becomes not a tool but a preference. This preference subtly reshapes Billy's sense of identity. He begins to measure himself against his heroic form rather than developing alongside it. The child feels inadequate by comparison. The hero feels invincible by contrast. This asymmetry creates quiet resentment. Billy does not resent the power itself. He resents the version of himself that cannot access it without ritual. The gap between who he is and who he can become grows wider with each use. The antagonistic forces of the story begin to respond to this imbalance. Opposition emerges not merely as evil to be defeated, but as pressure applied to weak points in the structure. Threats escalate not in strength alone, but in complexity. They test judgment rather than force. They provoke reaction rather than confrontation. Each encounter reveals how thin Billy's ethical grounding remains beneath the spectacle. The hero responds instinctively. He meets pressure with display. When challenged, he asserts dominance. When confused, he improvises. These tactics succeed often enough to mask their fragility. The audience, like the city, is encouraged to enjoy the momentum. The fantasy remains intact because it continues to function. Failure is deferred, yet small fractures appear. Collateral damage goes unnoticed. Authority figures defer too easily. Lines of accountability blur. The hero's presence begins to reshape the moral landscape. Actions once considered reckless are reframed as necessary. Speed replaces deliberation. Strength replaces dialogue. These shifts are subtle but cumulative. Billy does not consciously choose this trajectory. It emerges through reinforcement. The system rewards immediacy and punishes hesitation. Each time he acts without reflection and succeeds, reflection feels less necessary. Each time he hesitates and risks loss, hesitation feels dangerous. The psychological lesson is clear. Thinking slows power. Power prefers motion. This dynamic reveals the central tension of the narrative. Power that arrives without maturity does not remain neutral. It pulls development toward itself, warping the path that should have led to integration. Billy's growth does not stop. It detours. He matures around the power rather than into it. The boy adapts by avoiding confrontation with his own incompleteness. The first stage of the conflict thus solidifies the pattern. Authority is exercised without internal constraint. Success reinforces avoidance. The split between child and hero widens into a structural divide. The city becomes accustomed to spectacle. Billy becomes accustomed to escape. Neither is yet aware of what is being deferred. This is not the moment of collapse. It is the moment of alignment. The system settles into a rhythm that feels stable precisely because it is unchallenged. The fantasy proves itself functional, and that functionality becomes its strongest defense. But stability achieved through avoidance does not eliminate tension. It stores it. The stage is now set for escalation. Not because the hero will suddenly fail, but because the system has made failure inevitable. The more power circulates without maturity, the more the narrative must introduce forces capable of exposing the cost of that imbalance. The next phase does not arrive as surprise. It arrives as consequence. Escalation arrives not as a reversal of fortune, but as a change in pressure. The world begins to demand more from Captain Marvel than spectacle. Threats no longer present themselves as singular obstacles to be removed. They arrive layered, ambiguous, and strategically placed. The narrative shifts from moments of triumph to stretches of sustained tension. Victory is no longer guaranteed by presence alone. Judgment begins to matter. Billy responds to this shift with the same mechanism that has always worked. He transforms. He asserts. He moves forward quickly. Yet the environment has changed. The city's reliance on him has grown so complete that his absence now creates anxiety. His presence no longer reassures by contrast. It reassures by necessity. The hero has become infrastructure. When infrastructure falters, even briefly, the cost is immediate. This is where the fantasy of innocence begins to erode, not through moral failure, but through exposure. Billy is forced into decisions that cannot be resolved through force alone. He must choose between conflicting goods, between outcomes that all carry cost. The adult form supplies strength, but not discernment. The child supplies feeling, but not distance. The split that once allowed easy escape now produces paralysis. Authority figures respond by deferring even more. They step back rather than stepping in. Responsibility concentrates around the hero, but guidance does not follow. The throne grows heavier, not because the crown has changed, but because the ground beneath it remains hollow. Billy is now expected to function as a stabilizing force for systems he does not understand. The antagonists sense this vulnerability. They do not need to overpower him. They need only to stretch the situation beyond his capacity to improvise. Conflicts are designed to provoke haste, to force decisions before reflection can occur. The hero's speed becomes a liability. His certainty becomes brittle. Each misjudgment ripples outward, not as catastrophe, but as distortion. Billy begins to experience the transformation differently. It no longer feels like escape. It feels like obligation. The ritual still works, but the pleasure drains from it. The adult body carries expectation rather than relief. The boy begins to feel trapped by the very mechanism that once liberated him. Yet stepping away feels impossible. Without the hero, the world seems exposed. Without the hero, Billy feels irrelevant again. This psychological bind deepens the split. Billy avoids reflection not because he lacks intelligence, but because reflection threatens collapse. To question his readiness would be to question the legitimacy of the entire structure. The fantasy has become too large to dismantle safely. Innocence is no longer a personal trait. It is a public asset. The city needs him to remain uncomplicated. As pressure increases, the hero's actions grow more rigid. Flexibility gives way to routine. He relies on established responses even when circumstances shift. This rigidity is not cruelty. It is fatigue disguised as certainty. The system has trained him to equate hesitation with failure. He responds accordingly. The cultural dimension of the conflict sharpens here. The audience begins to sense the gap between symbol and substance. The hero still looks complete, but his decisions reveal strain. The myth begins to wobble. Not enough to break, but enough to invite scrutiny. The fantasy demands increasing maintenance. Billy's relationships suffer quietly. Those who encounter him as a child see someone distracted, impatient, and diminished. Those who encounter him as a hero see someone distant, procedural, and overextended. Neither identity feels fully inhabited. The oscillation accelerates, but integration remains elusive. This stage of the narrative exposes the cost of deferred maturation. Power does not wait for growth. It accumulates consequence regardless. Billy has been spared early reckoning, but not eliminated it. The bill arrives compounded. Each unresolved decision adds weight to the structure he stands upon. The system now functions under strain. Success still occurs, but it no longer reassures. Each victory feels narrower. Each mistake carries longer shadows. The fantasy of innocence persists, but it requires denial to sustain itself. The audience is invited to notice the effort involved. The conflict has fully taken shape. It is no longer about whether Billy can wield power. It is about whether power can continue to protect him from the developmental costs it has postponed. The next phase will not introduce new forces. It will intensify existing ones until avoidance becomes impossible. The crown still shines. The city still applauds. But the ground beneath the throne has begun to shift, and the weight it bears is no longer evenly distributed. The system reaches a point where every response reproduces the same tension it attempts to resolve. Captain Marvel intervenes, succeeds, and leaves behind a world more dependent than before. Billy returns to his smaller life carrying residual pressure that does not belong there. The oscillation accelerates until neither state provides rest. Movement continues because stopping would expose how little ground remains unexamined. At this stage, power no longer feels like capacity. It feels like momentum. Decisions are made because delay threatens stability, not because clarity has been achieved. The hero acts to preserve the system that now requires his constant presence. What began as protection has become maintenance. The city does not ask whether he should intervene. It assumes he will. The fantasy has matured into expectation. Billy's internal landscape tightens in response. The child's impulses do not disappear. They are compressed. Frustration surfaces as impatience. Fear surfaces as bravado. Desire surfaces as entitlement. These are not moral failures. They are developmental signals that have nowhere to go. The adult form absorbs them without metabolizing them. Power functions as a seal rather than a channel. Antagonistic pressure sharpens accordingly. Challenges are engineered to exploit speed, visibility, and public consequence. The hero is drawn into arenas where every action is amplified, recorded, echoed. Errors cannot remain local. Even restraint carries symbolic cost. The environment of visibility transforms judgment into performance. The hero must appear decisive even when uncertainty dominates. This is where innocence becomes dangerous, not because it is false, but because it is insufficient. Billy's lack of cynicism does not protect him from manipulation. It exposes him to it. Opposing forces mirror his desire to be seen as good, reliable, and necessary. They bait him into overextension. They stretch his mandate beyond coherence. Each concession feels small. The accumulation is not. The city responds by hardening its expectations. Nuance recedes. Outcomes become binary. Success is defined by absence of disaster rather than presence of growth. The hero adapts by narrowing his field of concern. He prioritizes immediate containment over long-range consequence. This is not cowardice. It is triage performed without training. Billy's sense of self begins to erode at the margins. He no longer measures time by days or seasons, but by crises resolved and crises pending. His interior life contracts. There is little space for reflection when urgency defines worth. The child remains alive, but increasingly abstract. He exists as memory rather than participant. The transformation itself becomes strained. Not mechanically, but symbolically. The ritual still produces the hero, but the meaning of the change has shifted. It no longer represents becoming more. It represents avoiding less. Power is now the condition for participation. Without it, Billy feels exposed. With it, he feels obligated. There is no neutral ground. The narrative refuses catharsis here. There is no single mistake that explains everything. There is no villain whose defeat restores balance. The imbalance is systemic. It emerges from the original substitution of power for development. What was skipped cannot be recovered through escalation. Each attempt to compensate through greater display only deepens the deficit. The audience is now positioned differently. Identification gives way to observation. The fantasy is no longer seamless. The seams show. Viewers are invited to notice how often the hero solves problems by compressing them rather than resolving them. How frequently spectacle replaces reckoning. How easily relief is mistaken for repair. Billy does not collapse under this weight. That would offer clarity. Instead, he persists. He adapts. He functions. This persistence is itself the revelation. A system can remain operational long after it has lost coherence. A hero can continue acting even as the conditions that once justified his role decay. By the end of this stage, the conflict has fully polarized. On one side stands the symbol of innocence empowered, endlessly reinforced by visibility and demand. On the other stands the unfinished individual whose development has been indefinitely postponed by the very mechanism meant to save him. The two can no longer be reconciled through alternation. Integration has become the unspoken threat. The narrative does not announce this as tragedy. It presents it as continuity. The hero remains. The city remains. The fantasy remains. What has changed is density. The weight of what is unresolved now presses against every action. The system has not broken. It has hardened. From here, the story can only move outward. The conflict has exceeded the boundaries of individual psychology. It has become cultural. The question is no longer whether Billy can grow into his power. It is whether a culture that rewards innocence without maturity can recognize the cost of doing so before the myth ossifies completely. At this point, the conflict no longer belongs to Billy Batson alone. It has migrated into the symbolic economy of the world around him. Captain Marvel is no longer read as an individual actor, but as a stabilizing myth, a living reassurance that power can remain morally uncomplicated if it originates from innocence. The culture absorbs this assumption eagerly, because it resolves a deeper anxiety about authority. It suggests that domination can be benevolent without discipline, that force can remain pure without undergoing the slow corrosion of responsibility. The city reorganizes itself around this belief. Institutions atrophy quietly. Decision-making becomes reactive rather than structural. Why invest in systems that prevent crisis when spectacle can resolve it after the fact? The presence of the hero reduces the perceived need for collective maturity. Accountability is displaced upward toward the figure who appears capable of absorbing all consequences. The myth does not merely protect the city. It infantilizes it. This displacement produces a subtle but pervasive distortion in how responsibility is imagined. Moral weight becomes centralized rather than distributed. Citizens learn to measure safety by proximity to the hero rather than by coherence of social structure. Authority figures learn to defer rather than deliberate. Power is no longer something negotiated collectively. It is something awaited. This dynamic mirrors Billy's internal split on a cultural scale. Just as he alternates between child and hero, the city alternates between dependency and relief. The symbolic appeal of Captain Marvel intensifies under these conditions. He becomes a vessel for projected virtue. His smiling certainty reassures precisely because it lacks visible struggle. In a cultural moment marked by exhaustion with ambiguity, the fantasy of uncomplicated goodness becomes irresistible. The hero does not ask difficult questions. He resolves visible threats. The absence of introspection reads as confidence. The absence of doubt reads as strength. Yet this appeal carries a hidden cost. By elevating innocence to a governing principle, the culture discourages the development of ethical complexity. Ambivalence is reframed as weakness. Hesitation as failure. Growth is unnecessary. The myth teaches that power should feel easy when wielded by the right person. When it does not, the problem is externalized rather than examined. This logic extends into the audience's relationship with the narrative itself. Viewers are invited to enjoy the fantasy without interrogating its structure. Identification is encouraged at the level of wish fulfillment rather than reflection. Who would not want the ability to escape vulnerability instantly? Who would not want to be believed without explanation? The story flatters these desires, even as it quietly demonstrates their consequences. The cultural environment of visibility intensifies this effect. Captain Marvel operates within a landscape where actions are amplified instantly. Success circulates faster than context. Failure lingers longer than understanding. The hero becomes a node of symbolic saturation. Every gesture is read as statement. Every omission as choice. The pressure to remain legible replaces the freedom to evolve. This environment rewards surface coherence over internal integration. The hero must remain recognizable to function. Any visible shift in demeanor risks destabilizing the myth. As a result, change becomes threatening. Growth implies inconsistency. Consistency implies stasis. The narrative reveals how symbols resist the very development they require to remain ethical. The antagonistic forces in the story gain cultural resonance here. They are no longer merely obstacles to be overcome. They function as stress tests for the myth. Each challenge exposes how fragile the fantasy of innocence becomes when confronted with systemic complexity. The villains do not need to defeat the hero. They need only to reveal how much labor is required to maintain his simplicity. The audience begins to experience a shift in perception. Admiration gives way to unease, not because the hero becomes cruel, but because the pattern becomes visible. Problems recur. Solutions compress rather than resolve. Relief replaces repair. The myth no longer reads as aspirational. It reads as evasive. This shift mirrors broader cultural tensions around leadership and authority. The desire for figures who appear morally intact collides with the reality that power magnifies unresolved traits rather than erasing them. Captain Marvel becomes a symbolic case study in what happens when societies confuse purity with readiness. The fantasy comforts in the short term and destabilizes in the long term. The narrative's enduring power lies in this tension. It does not condemn innocence. It interrogates its elevation to governing principle. It does not argue that Billy should never have been chosen. It reveals what happens when choice replaces cultivation, when crowns are bestowed without structures capable of supporting them. By the end of this section, the story has fully transcended individual psychology. It operates as a cultural mirror. The hero is no longer just a character. He is a symptom, a reflection of a collective wish to bypass maturation while retaining authority. The myth persists not because it is true, but because it answers a desire that remains unresolved. What remains is not a question of right or wrong. It is a question of sustainability. How long can a culture rely on innocence to govern power before the weight of what has been deferred begins to fracture the image it depends upon? The answer is not given directly. It is implied through accumulation, through repetition, through the growing sense that the myth is holding something back that cannot remain contained forever. The legacy of Billy Batson and Captain Marvel does not announce itself as failure. It announces itself as persistence. The myth remains intact precisely because it never collapses into obvious contradiction. It continues to function, to reassure, to circulate. The hero still arrives. The threats are still repelled. The city still breathes easier in his presence. What changes is not the outcome, but the residue left behind by repetition. Over time, the distinction between symbol and structure becomes permanent. Captain Marvel no longer represents a moment of transformation. He represents a state of suspension. Growth is neither achieved nor abandoned. It is postponed indefinitely. The hero exists in a loop of readiness that never ripens into wisdom. Billy exists in a parallel loop of waiting that never matures into agency. The system stabilizes around this division, treating it as natural. This stabilization is the true aftermath. The narrative does not end with reckoning, because reckoning would imply integration. Instead, it ends with sedimentation. The unresolved elements settle into place and harden. Innocence becomes an aesthetic rather than a developmental stage. Power becomes a role rather than a responsibility. Authority becomes something performed rather than inhabited. The cultural memory of Captain Marvel reflects this shift. He is remembered not for difficult choices or ethical evolution, but for consistency of appearance and outcome. His image remains clean. His narrative remains accessible. Complexity is edited out through repetition. The myth rewards recognizability over transformation. Each retelling reinforces the same contours, smoothing over the strain that once threatened to surface. Billy's inner life recedes further from view, not because it disappears, but because the myth has no use for it. The child remains present as origin story, as justification, as proof of purity. He is not allowed to develop beyond this function. His incompleteness becomes essential to the myth's coherence. A mature Billy would disrupt the fantasy by demanding continuity between power and personhood. This dynamic reveals the final ethical cost of the story. The preservation of innocence becomes a form of containment. It freezes the subject at the moment of selection. Billy is not permitted to outgrow the conditions that made him desirable. Growth would introduce ambiguity. Ambiguity would destabilize trust. The myth requires him to remain unfinished in order to remain usable. The city mirrors this condition. It does not collapse into chaos, but it does not evolve either. Reliance replaces resilience. Memory replaces reform. Each crisis resolved by the hero becomes a reason not to address underlying fragilities. The presence of Captain Marvel allows structural weakness to persist without immediate consequence. The system survives by narrowing its definition of success. This narrowing shapes how future authority is imagined. Leadership becomes associated with appearance rather than process. Moral legitimacy is inferred from origin rather than earned through adaptation. The fantasy teaches that if power begins pure, it will remain so. The labor of maintenance is rendered invisible. The cost of stagnation is deferred to an undefined future. The audience carries this legacy forward. The character endures because he satisfies a persistent wish. The wish to remain good without becoming complex. The wish to be strong without being changed by strength. The wish to escape vulnerability without losing legitimacy. Captain Marvel embodies these desires without interrogating them directly. That embodiment is his cultural function. Yet the narrative's endurance also preserves its critique. Even when unspoken, the structure remains visible to those willing to observe it. The split never heals. The oscillation never resolves. The absence of integration becomes the defining feature of the myth. What is remembered is not a journey completed, but a tension sustained. This is why the story continues to resonate. It captures a psychological truth that extends beyond its genre. Power acquired too early does not simply overwhelm the individual. It reshapes the conditions under which growth is allowed to occur. When authority arrives without preparation, it does not wait for maturity to catch up. It reorganizes life around its own demands. Billy Batson becomes a symbol not of failure, but of arrested development protected by spectacle. Captain Marvel becomes a symbol not of corruption, but of avoidance elevated to virtue. Together, they form a composite figure that reveals how easily cultures conflate goodness with readiness and visibility with legitimacy. The aftermath is not tragic in the conventional sense. There is no fall from grace. There is no moral reversal. There is only endurance. The myth continues because it adapts just enough to remain functional, while resisting the one change that would resolve its core tension. Integration is never allowed to occur. The final clarity offered by the narrative is structural rather than emotional. It reveals that innocence cannot govern power indefinitely without becoming a liability. Not because innocence is false, but because it is incomplete. Power demands engagement with consequence, contradiction, and limitation. When these are deferred, they do not disappear. They accumulate. The legacy of Captain Marvel thus persists as a quiet warning embedded within a comforting form. It does not ask the audience to reject the fantasy. It asks them to notice what the fantasy requires in order to survive. A child who cannot grow, a hero who cannot change, a system that functions by postponing its own reckoning. This permanence is the story's final state. The conflict does not resolve. It settles. It becomes background. It becomes tradition. The myth remains available to each new generation precisely because it does not conclude. It offers power without demanding maturity, and in doing so, it preserves the tension that makes it endlessly repeatable.